the things that's so exciting about that situation is that the borders are very pliable, and we've seen creative people across very diverse areas of study, music and art, philosophy, literature, medicine, and sociology, all pitch their tents to have a look around this new land. Over the next few days, we invite you to explore with us the broad and deep influence of disability on and in our everyday lives. But today and tomorrow and Saturday as well, you're going to have the opportunity to both listen to and engage with scholars and performers, activists, practitioners, community members, and stakeholders as they share their very unique perspectives on how minds and bodies misfit in the world. Before I hand things off to Doug, I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge and thank the symposium organizing team. Teresa Mangum, who's the director of the Obermann Center, Jennifer New, the associate director, Erin Hackathorn, who's the operations director, Hope Gerlach, where are you, Hope? Who is a doctoral candidate in communication sciences and disorders, and Corey Hickner-Johnson, wherever Corey is, who is a doctoral candidate in the Department of English. This was a fabulous team to work with, and none of this would have been possible without the efforts of the whole team. So thanks very much. I'd like to introduce Doug Benton.
Good afternoon. It's so great to see so many people here, a lot of familiar faces and a lot of new people who I don't know that I look forward to having a chance to talk with you individually. My name is Doug Benton. I'm in the history department, a nearly retired member of the history department. Tricia's been giving me advice on the transition to come. So I'm co-director with Tricia of the symposium, and I think that sounds a little more impressive than it really is. Working with the Obermann Center to put on a symposium is kind of like having a great architect walk up to you and say, I'd like to build you a beautiful house. Could I do that for you? And you say, sure, okay, I'll do that. And so you meet with the architect and the team, and they show you all your options, photos of various kinds of beautiful houses they've done in the past, and various features you can have, and you say, oh, I like this, and I like that, and I'll take this. And once in a while you make a suggestion, and the architect very gently explains that that's a nice idea, but probably would make the house fall down. But here's another way we could do it and achieve the same effect. So you work with them, and then they go off and build your house. And you move in, and you invite all your friends over, and you say, look at this great house I built. So the architects of this house are the good folks at the Obermann Center, who Tricia already mentioned. Thank you very much to all of you for making this possible. Back in 1997, when I was preparing to teach my first graduate seminar in the history of disability, I was looking for readings, and they were not very thick on the ground at that time for my graduate students, but there was a new book out titled Extraordinary Bodies, Figuring Physical Disability in American Culture and Literature. Now, historians don't tend to assign literary scholars work in their seminars because it's different approach, different kinds of evidence, different methodologies. But this book blew me away. It said all the things that I wanted to say to my graduate students, plus a lot of things I hadn't thought of that to say to the graduate students. And I used that book to lead off the semester because it just laid out the issues so clearly and made so exciting the idea that disability was not something that simply happened to someone's body and that was a misfortune for an individual, but that permeated our culture in terms of representations and images and meanings that we associate with bodies that vary from the typical or extraordinary bodies, as Rosemarie called them. So it was a transformative book for me and for the field of disability studies in general. Rosemarie Garland-Thomson is now a professor of English and bioethics at Emory University, where she teaches disability studies, bioethics, American literature, and feminist theory. And she has continued since that first book to break new ground. She's the author of Staring, How We Look, a book that I highly recommend as a very serious but also very fun book about how staring works, why we stare at certain things and certain people, and what it does to the starer and the staree when that kind of relationship is happening in the moment. In 2016, she wrote the first in a New York Times weekly series of op-ed essays by disabled people, and is now co-editing a collection of those essays, which will come out titled About Us, Essays from the New York Times about people with disability, about disability by people with disabilities. She's published 3 edited volumes and many important articles, including the one that we took the title and theme of our conference, or our symposium from, in which she proposed the idea of disability as a matter of misfitting, and talked about disability not as a stable, generic category, but as rather a series of encounters, a dynamic series of encounters between particular bodies and particular times and places. So it helps us to think about disability as not a static state of being, but rather a dynamic process of fitting and misfitting that occurs as we move through and attempt to navigate our lives with these always vulnerable, ornery, and unpredictable bodies that we live in. So it's my pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker, Rosemarie Garland-Thomson.
Thank you. Well, it takes a village. Actually, I'm going to need a little light. This front one, I didn't think about this. No, these. It's called, no, this one right here. It's like the east and the west. That one? Yeah, perfect. No, we did it. Yeah, perfect, thank you. Thank you, Hope. I am delighted and honored to be here. Doug, thank you for that generous introduction, eloquent and generous introduction. I want to thank you, the audience, for coming to this marvelous event and for being here to allow me to share my work with you. I want to note the honor of the title of the symposium, Misfitting, Disability Broadly Considered. I think it's actually a really brilliant title, not so much in the misfitting part, but in the broadly considered part. So I hoped that my talk and time with you here today can further our understanding of the broadly considered part of disability. I want to thank, of course, the organizers of the conference, Aaron Hackleworth and Teresa Magnum from the Obermann Center, particularly to Hope Gerlach and Corey Hickner-Johnson, who are the village who will be helping make this presentation come forward, and who are graduate students involved in the symposium and organizing it. And of course to Tricia Zabrowski and my beloved colleague and friend Doug Benton as the directors of the symposium and the occasion for which we really are gathered here together. I'm particularly honored that I discovered that this is the Ida Cordelia Beam Distinguished Visiting Professor at the University of Iowa. So I am that person today here with you. And it turns out that Ida Cordelia Beam, I want to tell you, was a quiet Iowa woman born in Lynn County in 1883 to a farming family who farmed hogs. She was, over her lifetime, a school teacher, a traveler, and upon her death at 92, she left 291 acres to the University of Iowa for educational purposes. And apparently we know very little about Ida Cordelia Beam's life other than what I just told you, and a little bit maybe about the land that she owned and the family that she came from. So she was like so many women who lived out their lives, did their work, made their relationships, and the details of whose lives are lost to us. So it's a particular honor to come forward and share my work with you under the name of Ida Cordelia Beam. I think she'd be delighted that we're all here together. So thank you. So my presentation today is, I have a better title, called Finding Disability Everywhere, Misfits in the Frankenstein Ballet. And I want to begin by calling attention to the accessible environment that I'm trying to create here and that we're all working together to try to create. And this presentation is intentionally crafted to contain multiple formats. And I'm very happy to say that we have an additional format today. In addition to the auditory format, which is my voice, and there'll be a little bit of music, the visual format, which is the PowerPoint presentation, and also the views of the speakers and the people who are engaged in this presentation. But we also have today the real-time captioning, which is a particularly robust version to give a complete suite of multiple formats of accessibility for the presentation. What this tends to do is to make the presentation a little bit longer than usual, because I will be showing pictures and I will be talking about the pictures and describing them at the same time. So I'm hoping that I can ask for your patience in this. I'm going to begin in the same place with the same slide that I begin every single presentation that I ever give with. And that is to quote the first principle of critical disability studies. And this is the first principle of critical disability studies, not only in my opinion, but I think many people would agree with this. And this is an insight, if you will. It's a claim that comes from Douglas Benton, and that is, disability is everywhere once you know how to look for it. And Doug's work that began at the same time that my work began, and that has been intertwined in my own work over the years, gives us an example, and I teach Doug's work in every theory class I teach, whether it's feminist theory, whether it's critical disability theory, whether it's the theory of bioethics and health humanities. I always teach one of Doug's essays, particularly the early essay on immigration, as the best example I've ever found of the practice of intersectionality. Because what Doug is able to do in his historical analysis of the making of disability in the modern era is to intertwine and to hold together throughout the entire piece, all of them actually, but I'm talking specifically about the immigration piece, which I don't know what it's called. I just call it the immigration piece, in which Doug is able to hold an analysis of race, gender, disability, and class, and intertwine them throughout the entire narrative that he puts together. It's absolutely exemplary, and I'm grateful for it. So thank you, Doug Benton. So I'm going to begin with elaborating on this first principle, this premise, disability is everywhere, once you know how to look for it, by thinking about some of the concepts embedded in this short claim. And I'll start with what is disability. And I'm going to offer you 3 definitions of disability, and they are my definitions that I have put forward. There are 3 kind of different ways of thinking about disability using different language that I have used over the years to talk about disability. So first, the human variations that we think of as disabilities, and I very often talk about disability this way because I want to call attention to its artificiality in a way, to the way that the term has evolved as a description, historically situated, of the human variations that we think of as disabilities. So the human variations that we think of as disabilities are part of the human condition that occur in every life and family and are a theme in all art and culture. And that's what I'm going to talk to you mostly about today. So second, disability, and this is a bit more of a literary kind of belletristic notion of disability, is that disability might be considered a record written on the body of our encounters between flesh and world. Another way of thinking about disability, other than thinking of it as an archive or a record, is to think about the lived experiences of disability. So the lived experiences of disability give people and communities, so individuals and groups, opportunities for expression, creativity, resourcefulness, relationships, and flourishing. Flourishing is a term used in philosophy, not so much in literary studies, that I think is a very important term in terms of, in bringing forward the generative potential of disability that I try to talk about as often as I possibly can. Disability makes things. So, where then do we find disability once we know how to look for it? So we find disability in many places, but what I want to suggest today and focus on is that we find disability in literature, art, dance, and music. And I'm going to spend most of the time talking about literature, art, and primarily dance as I speak to you about the Frankenstein Ballet. So I want to talk about the stories of disability, the narratives that are generated by the human experience of disability and its relationships and what it makes within the world. So we make and unmake stories about disability from words, from pictures, from objects, from gestures, and from sounds. And I'm going to focus on how we make stories from gestures when I talk a little bit later about the Frankenstein Ballet, which of course is a gestural narrative, a story told through movement and arrangement of bodies. So the stories about disability that we have available to us cross all genre, all media, time periods, aesthetic themes, and cultures. In other words, disability is everywhere once we know how to look for it and how to find it, as Doug has reminded us. So what then does finding disability do? And this is partly the work that I've been attempting to undertake as a bioethicist, and I'm not going to talk a lot about that today, but bioethics is understood as an applied field, where literary studies might be understood more as a field of description and explication. So I'm going to think about what the stories we tell about disability might do in the world. So finding disability, as I've suggested, is an opportunity to explore, to redefine, and to make new stories about what it means to be human. I want to offer another premise of my own work, and that is finding disability helps us understand how communities make and unmake the human variations we think of as disabilities. And I think Doug's work has been particularly important in this because, of course, Doug is finding historical narratives. He's making historical narratives from the archive. So I want to work a little bit with you in the remaining time I have to help find the tradition of disability as an aesthetic and a narrative resource. That's what I want to concentrate on. So let me give you some examples here, starting with literature and the media arts to show us a little bit, move through quickly some examples of where we find disability in the human archive of knowledge. So the founding story of Western culture, I want to submit, is bookended by disability, and that is the story of Oedipus, Oedipus the king, Sophocles' story, which begins with Oedipus's broken foot from which he is identified, and it ends with Oedipus's blindness, his self-inflicted blindness, which is a metaphor for the knowledge that he has gained along the journey that is his life. We have a very vibrant literature of monster, creature, hybrid creatures, and freaks. That literature, which I dipped into a bit today myself, and that we're going to look at a little bit today, and I wanted to give you some examples of monsters and creatures in the narrative archive about disability. Caliban from The Tempest, Frankenstein, of course, and The Elephant Man are just a few examples of these stories of hybrids and creatures as people with disabilities. In American literature, as many of us know, the two most canonical pieces, novels of American literature from the 19th and the 20th centuries are Herman Melville's Moby Dick. I'm showing the cover here of that book, as well as the cover of William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury from the 20th century. Both of the protagonists of these important novels of American literature are people with disabilities. We, of course, have a vibrant culture of disability literature and poetics. I'm showing here a picture of the poet Paul Guest, who is a man with quadriplegia. I call him a mouthstick poet, with his own permission, because when he reads his poetry, he uses a mouthstick, and I'm showing him here with the mouthstick kind of in the corner, tucked in the corner of his mouth. This reminds me of those images of FDR with his cigarette holder, in which he swipes through on his phone to read his poetry. And it gives his poetry a very particular cadence when he reads it out loud, manipulating his device with his mouthstick. It's a very beautiful performance if you ever get the opportunity to see it. In more popular media, the disabled comedian Maysoon Zayid is a stand-up comedian who always sits down and calls attention to that. She's a comedian with cerebral palsy who has developed a persona around cerebral palsy and the particular and distinctive characteristics of that form of embodiment in speech and turned it into a marvelous comedic routine. So go look at her TED Talk if you get the opportunity to do it. I want to end this particular section, of course, with the image of Peter Dinklage from the Game of Thrones. And if you've had the opportunity to see him in The Station Agent, which is a wonderful film. If you haven't had that opportunity, please be sure to do it. But of course, he has captured the attention of, as far as I'm able to understand, the entire world in the Game of Thrones. And this is an image here that I'm showing of him as well in the style issue, I love this, of Esquire magazine. And here he is on the front in this handsome suit with looking kind of like some version of George Clooney. And Maureen Dowd has interviewed him and has pronounced that he is America's first dwarf heartthrob. And I think she's absolutely right. So art and design. I wanted to spend a little time on this to call attention to the visual representation of disability in the Western archive through paintings, pictures, and objects. I want to talk a bit about objects. So Where do we find disability has been my question. We find disability as a subject of art. For example, this is a picture from 1568 by Peter Bruegel, the elder, of what he calls the cripples. And this is a collection of men with their prosthetic devices that look as if they are homemade, out and about in the public world in a pre-modern era. So people with disabilities have always been with us. They have always been in the public sphere in one way or another. Of course, the long tradition of representation of humanity on Greek vases, of course, includes people with disabilities. This is one of many, many, many Greek vases that have representations of people with disabilities. In this case, it's a person of small stature on a vase from the 5th century BC. A little bit later, into the 20th century, we have the early 20th century, we have an example here of what I call war protest art or protest art that utilizes disability. This is a very important genre. This is a painting called Gassed from 1918 by John Singer Sargent, which shows a row of men who are leaving the battlefield holding on to one another, shoulder to shoulder, arm to shoulder, in the way that blind people often navigate. And these are men who have been gassed and, of course, been made blind as they march off the battlefield. A more felicitous representation of blindness comes from Jacob Lawrence in 1938, part of the Harlem Renaissance. And this is a celebratory image. I have this image on the cover of my book, Staring, in many ways because I love it. It's a parade of blind beggars through a Harlem cityscape, and it looks very, as I said, celebratory. There's a lot of hooping and hollering, people paying a lot of attention as these blind beggars, very nattily dressed, march through this Harlem cityscape. We find disability shaping art as well, because most people will become disabled, all people will become disabled in one way or another over a lifetime. The aesthetic products that come from bodies considered disabled leave their imprint on the art that people with disabilities make. And I'm showing an image here, of course, two images of the artist Frida Kahlo, who had significant disabilities over her lifetime, in which she which informed the content of her artwork. Here is a painting, a late painting, and we very often see the imprint of disability in art in the late works of artists. This is a water lilies painting from 1914, more or less, through 1926, from Claude Monet, who was, of course, an impressionist painter whose paintings became more and more impressionistic as he became more and more blind over the course of his lifetime. And this is understood as an aesthetic evolution in the works of Monet. Vincent van Gogh, of course, uses the representation of disability here in his self-portrait, and we have many really wonderful self-portraits of people with disabilities, and I've done a little bit of work about this. I didn't show a picture here of Riva Lehrer, but I think it would be interesting for you to look at some of her work. Anyway, this shows Van Gogh, and he identifies himself in this portrait as a person with a disability, if you will, by painting a picture of himself with what he calls a bandaged ear. He's a one-eared artist in this portrait. Following along, later on in the next century, we have a whole genre of self-representation art, self-representation, that is part of the early breast cancer movement, in which women presented themselves in our aesthetic products as one-breasted women, women who had had breast cancer and had mastectomies. This is a sculpture from Nancy Fried, torso with hands on hips, in this kind of Amazonian smart-ass pose from 1994 of a one-breasted woman, a headless one-breasted woman. We also find disability, of course, as a concept in art, and I'm showing here an image of a line drawing by the disabled artist Neil Neil Marcus, of a man using a wheelchair. And this, of course, is part of the iconography of disability that permeates the public sphere. And that is the international symbol of access. And we have here, I'm showing the original international symbol of access from 1968. That is the blue stick figure of the wheelchair user that marks accessible paths and the accessible environment everywhere in our world today. And on the right, I have the newer image, which is controversial but also very interesting, and we might want to talk about this, by Sarah Hendren from 2010, of a more dynamic wheelchair user here, leaning forward into the future. I'm showing here an image of the artist Christine Sun Kim, who is a deaf sound artist. And her work is particularly interesting. She does installation work. Most of her work is installation and video work. She uses ASL, and she explores in her work the relationship between sound and deafness. And I think this is particularly interesting because we imagine in our traditional narratives that deafness is the absence of sound. And what Christine Sun Kim's work does is explore the presence of sound in deafness. The disabled artist Catherine Sherwood has revised and rewritten, re-imaged a number of important paintings, Venus paintings from the Western tradition. This is a rewriting or a re-narration of Edward Manet's Olympia, in which she takes Olympia and gives Olympia a leg brace, and also gives Olympia a new face that is based on brain imaging of Catherine Sherwood herself. So this is a self-portrait in some way. Catherine Sherwood is a person who has significant disabilities as a result of a stroke. Another piece of disability art that I want to share with you is a painting here by Jessie Park, an artist with autism, who is representing here, I want to show you this because it represents in some ways an interesting emergent genre, which I call the art of neurodiversity. This is a picture of what Jessie Park calls the structure of flame. And it's a drawing in which she uses the compositions of chemistry in order to illustrate flame as she understands it. I'm going to finish up art here by showing an image here from Judith Scott. Judith Scott is a now very well-known disabled artist. She was a woman who was deaf and had Down syndrome and was a sculptor. She began wrapping fiber art and producing sculpture and produced many, many, many important pieces that began with art therapy, but began to be understood as art therapy, and now is understood as a form of sculpture. And she actually had a show at the Brooklyn Museum, which was the first solo exhibition by Judith Scott in 2004. No, I'm sorry, it was a little bit later than that. But this was a really important piece of work. And what's interesting about Judith Scott is that she has produced all of this work and she has never commented on it at all. So I'm showing now some of the objects that are not necessarily understood as pieces of art that are created by people with disabilities. These are some shoes that Sandy Yee, the disabled artist and designer, designed for herself that fit and fit with her very unusually shaped feet. These are platform thong shoes in which from between her toes emerges a long and gracefully curved horn. This is Kathy D. Woods, who is an African-American woman of small stature who has a design company in which she produces bespoke clothes for small adults. This is a very important market that she serves. This is an example of the emerging technology of prosthetic limbs that are understood not as medical technologies, but rather as aesthetic objects. So what we have here is a full leg prosthetic that is designed through the Alternative Limb Project, which shows this beautiful prosthetic leg with a form that is mimetic of the human leg form, and it is encrusted oftentimes in, as these pieces are, with jewels, and in this case with flowers. And it is made to be looked at and made to be displayed. Another example comes from Joanna Hawley, who has designed this Eames chair-inspired prosthetic leg, and I'm showing a model here with a suit on, and again, he's a very handsome model, and his suit has short pants so that his leg is displayed as it is placed on the Eames chair for which it is designed. Finally, of course, the ramp itself, the symbol of the transformation of the built environment, the material manifestation of the transformation of the built environment, which began in 1968 to be a way to ruin a building by strapping onto it an ugly aluminum ramp which would reduce its value and make it an aesthetically hideous object, has transformed as designers and architects have begun to understand the ramp as an integral part of any design and have made beautiful ramps that are aesthetic enhancement to any building. And I'm showing you here, of course, the old ramp, if you will, which was not, of course, designed as a ramp in the Guggenheim Museum in New York, and the new ramp from the Ed Roberts campus in Berkeley, California, the red ramp that is at the very center of the Ed Roberts Center, rather than off to the side. So I'm going to complete my move through arts and culture here, finding disability, with a brief review of dance and as a gestural narrative. So I'm showing here a picture of a company called 5 Foot Feet, which contains my colleague, one of the dancers is my colleague, Catherine Cole, who is a one-legged woman. So there are 3 dancers in this company, and 2 of the dancers have 2 legs, and 1 of the dancers has 1 leg, and thus they call the company 5 Foot Feet, F-E-A-T, which of course is a pun on F-E-E-T. Here I have an image of Leroy Moore Jr., who is a poet and the creator of Crip Hop, which of course is a hack, if you will, of hip hop, and he's the co-founder of the disability performance art collective, Sins Invalid. And Leroy is an African-American dancer who has brought the dance form characteristic of African-American culture, that is hip hop, into disability culture. Here is Bill Shannon, who goes by the artistic name Crutchman. He is a crutch-using breakdancer who has incorporated his crutches into this new vocabulary of breakdancing movement that he has developed, using crutches that he has fitted with a rocker on the bottom in order to develop this new vocabulary movement of disability breakdancing. The dancer Claire Cunningham incorporates into her performances and choreography, and I'm showing you a picture here of Claire Cunningham using 4 arm crutches two of them traditionally on her arms, one around her neck and one supporting her foot, in order to emphasize the iconography of prosthetic equipment in new contemporary dance forms done by and developed by people with disabilities. I'm showing here images of two dancers, David Toole and Homer Avila, who have developed, again, a dance vocabulary and new dance performances that call into question the very essence of what we have previously imagined dance to be, and that is an endeavor that takes place on two legs. And so Homer Avila is a one-legged dancer who again developed an entire vocabulary of dance movements that suited his one-legged body. David Toole is, in my view, one of the most interesting dancers ever, and he's a legless dancer. I'm showing here an image that's one of my very favorite, and this is David Toole ambulating as he does through the world on one arm. He walks on his arms because he's a legless dancer and a legless person. And he's costumed here in this beautiful skirt-like fan costume that was designed for him by Alexander McQueen, the late British fashion designer. And this shows David Toole in perhaps one of his most important gestural movements that he's contributed to the vocabulary of contemporary dance. Wheelchair dancing, or disabled dancing, if you will, has developed, of course, tremendously, and I think some of the most promising and interesting work has been done by the dance company Kinetic Light, which at this point is composed of Alice Shepard with her co-dancer Laurel Lawson, and I'm showing here an image from their performance in 2017 called Descent, in which they again have developed an incredibly sophisticated movement vocabulary using wheelchairs. This shows Alice on her back, supporting Laurel in the air with the two wheelchairs as part of this choreography. And they also use a ramp, which is a very innovative form of introducing material objects into dance, performance, and choreography. So I'm going to talk now for the remainder of my time here with you about the ballet Frankenstein. And Frankenstein, of course, as you perhaps know, was originally titled The Modern Prometheus. It was a novel written in 1818, so last year was the centennial of the 200-year anniversary of Frankenstein, and so there was much about Frankenstein out and about the world. And Mary Shelley, of course, is the author of Frankenstein. Mary Shelley has a very literary genealogy, which I'm not going to talk about very much here because I want us to get to the story, and I want to share with you the story, the adaptation of the Frankenstein ballet. But just to point out that Frankenstein has had, over these 200 years, a great number of adaptations, of course, and I'm going to share with you one of those today. But the ones that we tend to know most about are things like Mel Brooks's Young Frankenstein. I'm showing you an image here of Gene Wilder and Igor, who I'm sure has a name, and I'm sorry I don't know it right now. And also, of course, Boris Karloff's performance in the film of Frankenstein, which has given us the image of Frankenstein as a monster. It's given us the image of the Halloween masks. It's given us the image of the scary, freaky Frankenstein that is most available to us now. And I want to suggest that the Frankenstein that I'm going to share with you is a very different kind of story. And I want to suggest that the form of classical ballet has provided an opportunity to retell, to adapt the Frankenstein story through a different genre, for different purposes, and given me the opportunity to read this ballet in interesting new ways. So the Frankenstein Ballet, which is choreographed by Liam Scarlett, how's that for a wonderful name, was performed in London at the Royal Opera House in 2017 and in San Francisco at the San Francisco Ballet in 2017 and 2018, which is where I saw the ballet. And I'm going to show you some clips from the London Royal Opera House. So let me tell you a little bit about the ballet, about the story. So I want to begin by saying that I read the Frankenstein Ballet through the book Far from the Tree, Parents, Children, and the Search for Identity, which is the 2012 book by Andrew Solomon, and a 2018 documentary of the same name, which if you have the opportunity to see it, I suggest that you do. It's a very engaging and in some ways different version of Andrew Solomon's topic than the book. But what Andrew Solomon does in the book is investigate how families navigate, and this is what I think is really brilliant about the conceptualization, how families navigate, both successfully and unsuccessfully, the entry into the family of a child who is unexpected and very different in that unexpectedness from the other members of the family. So the children that Andrew Solomon looks at in the families that he studies are children who are different from the parents. And he goes through a variety of different kinds of families. What I want to do is to use his premise here to think through the Frankenstein Ballet. So let me tell you the story a little bit of the Frankenstein Ballet, or the Frankenstein story. So the ballet begins with a very traditional prologue, and that is, it's a set that sets the scene, or it's a prologue that sets the scene. So we have the mother who dies young. We have a variety of different maids who dance in a variety of different classical ballet moves. When I saw this, and it was a long prologue, I have to say, I thought, oh no, this is the Nutcracker all over again. I was really dismayed. And what we have, of course, is the opportunity in this prologue to set the stage. And what we also have in the prologue is the opportunity to use very conventional forms of balletic movement. So, and the costuming, the arrangement, the stories, the nutcrackeriness, if you will, of ballet is carried forward here. So this is very traditional. And of course, the heart of ballet, as many of you know, is the pas de deux, which is a danced duet. Classically, it's a danced duet between a female lead and a male partner, and the role of the male partner is to hold up, basically, and to display the female dancer. So in the prologue of the Frankenstein Ballet, we have many pas de deux here. I'm showing you some of the images of Victor Frankenstein, who is the son of the family. He's getting ready to depart in this prologue from his family manor, which is in Ingolstadt, and his mother and his family are there, and he's leaving to go to medical school. And he's a kind of depressive, thoughtful man to begin with. And we have the entry in the prologue into the family of Elizabeth, and I'm showing you an image here of some of the pas de deux in the prologue between Victor and Elizabeth. Elizabeth is a sister figure who is an orphan who shows up at the front door, and she's brought into the family. And she ends up being Victor's betrothed. So the other thing that happens in the prologue, of course, is that the mother dies during childbirth. And so Victor is distraught at the loss of his mother, and his family is increased then through the death of his mother in childbirth with a very small infant son who is then to be raised by the other members of the family as Victor goes off to medical school. So more on the family a little bit later. So the second scene in the film is what we call the scene in the Anatomy Theater. And I'm showing you here an image of the Anatomy Theater, which begins to depart from classical ballet. What we have in the Anatomy Theater is a whole series, again, of corps de ballet dances with these maids in cute little outfits and these nurses, and suddenly we begin to see a transformation because it's very classical, very expected, but they start introducing things like medical specimens in jars and skeletons and some of the various medical apparatuses of a medical theater. So we start immediately to recognize that things are changing here. And at the very center of the Anatomy Theater is a dissection table with a figure on it, and I'm showing that in this image. And that figure on the dissection table is covered with a sheet. So after all of the medical students depart and the professor has failed to use galvanism, to use electricity, to make the corpse on the autopsy table come alive, Victor is left, after his medical friends go off to the tavern, to contemplate what it might mean to create life. And let me show you a clip here of what I call the creation scene. And I'm going to narrate it, describe it. I was hoping this would work as an embedded video, but of course it didn't, so. Hope is fulfilling her name. So here we have Victor in the Anatomy Theater. After he has got a good idea. So again, classical ballet moves. He is doing a performance, dancing around, leaping, and the leap, of course, is going to be a crucial balletic move throughout the entire performance. We have a galvanizing machine, which is a rather spectacular machine hanging above the autopsy table. Victor comes and he takes the specimen, he crashes it to the floor, does a few more leaps, balletic moves, dramatically turns on the galvanizing machine. It starts to spark and smoke and produce electricity. He brings it down. Actually, he brings it up. We see electricity, lightning flashing from it. This is very dramatic, very classical. Is Victor dancing, leaping with his solo. And we sense here that something is happening to the dance forms. And the electricity and the lightning dramatically engage as Victor moves toward the cadaver and pulls off the sheet to reveal the body sutured together. He leaps up on the creature's body astride the corpse to see if he has enlivened it, animated it. He begins to conclude that his experiment may have been a failure. He consults a book of knowledge. We see him in a posture of despondence and despair. He sinks to the floor in front of the autopsy table, which now, of course, looks like an altar. He puts his head on his hands in despair, and all is quiet. And then suddenly, the creature on the autopsy table, naked, his body is sutured and riven with red scars, begins to move. And he embraces Victor. And this is a theme that we'll see throughout the entire ballet. So this embrace is at once an act of love and a threat. And he grabs Victor's coat, Victor's terrified, and runs out of the room. And this, of course, sets the scene for the entire rest of the ballet. Thank you. And so what happens is that once the creature enters, everything changes about the ballet, everything changes about the dance forms, and the story moves forward. So here's an image of the creature. I want to describe a little bit his costuming. So the creature is naked. The creature is dressed in a white bodysuit, as I suggested, with red scarring and sutures throughout that outline all of the composition of the creature from a variety of different body parts. And so the creature, and this is what's really important about the performance, is that because of the restrictions of the balletic form, the creature must be another ballet dancer, just like the progenitor, that is to say, Victor Frankenstein, who has created him. And so this creates an opportunity for a kind of twinning, a situation of Doppelganger, in which Victor and his creation are parallel in form and shape and movement, but in opposition in costuming and in placement within the Frankenstein family. So what that gives us is the opportunity to see the creature trying to enter into the Frankenstein family in these various moves throughout, the various arrangements and the dances throughout the ballet. So I'm going to show you another image. I'll show you here an image of the creature attempting to enter into the Frankenstein family by attempting to use the dance moves that the Frankenstein family uses, which he does by going off to a birthday party for Victor's brother, who is named William, who is 8 years old at this time. And so they play blind man's bluff at the birthday party. And the creature, of course, in the ballet is always in the woods. And I'm showing an image here of the creature in front of the woods, in which is where he comes out from. He lurks in the woods all the time. And he enters into the yard of the Frankenstein family manor in order to try to engage with the family, to try to make the to try to enter into the family circle. And this is an image of him dancing with, learning to dance with William, who has a blindfold on and, of course, can't see who it is that he is dancing with. And so they perform a really interesting set of pas de deux here, until, of course, what happens is that William pulls off his blindfold and beholds the creature and is terrified and starts to scream, and the creature tries to quiet him and, of course, unintentionally kills him in order to quiet him, and then runs off back into the forest. And I'm going to show you another scene here of what happens next, and that is that Victor comes out after everyone has gone off and discovered William's death. And I won't go into the details of this, so that Victor again is alone in the yard. And what we have here is a pas de deux that gets repeated over and over again, in which the creature approaches Victor, as he did in the creation scene, to try to embrace him, to entreat him to accept and to recognize him as a member of the Frankenstein family. And of course, Victor's tragic flaw is his refusal to recognize and accept and acknowledge the creature that he has created, to his family, to the world, or to the creature. And this is acted out in a series of pas de deux. And I'll show, Hope and I will show you one of these so that you can see how this pas de deux, which is a form of embrace between Victor and the creature. Where'd they go? We can. You're there. Okay. 2. Mm-hmm. So this is the Frankenstein family manor yard, and Victor comes and finds a token left, and we see the creature emerging from the forest, as we saw in the creation scene, approaching Victor from behind and embracing Victor, entreating him to recognize the family relationship, the familial relationship. And in a vampiric gesture, he almost bites Victor on the neck. He takes Victor's face and forces Victor to look at him, naked as he is, with Victor's coat. And they engage in one of the many pas de deux, in which they are paired as father and son, man and man, brother and brother, in these balletic pas de deux. And of course, these pas de deux violate the traditional pas de deux because they are between two men. So the creature takes Elizabeth's scarf in a foreshadowing of what will come and entreats Victor to create a partner for him, a mate for him, and Victor refuses. And this is one of the moments in which the creature's will to be accepted is hardened into revenge. So Victor and Elizabeth are to be married, and Elizabeth is very distressed by Victor's despondence, by his refusal of enthusiasm and life, and she knows something's wrong, but she doesn't know what's wrong. So the next scene is the wedding scene, and we have again a series of pas de deux that is part, and corps de ballet performances of the bride and the groom, Victor and Elizabeth, dressed in the traditional white. This could come directly out of Swan Lake, of course. But there's also a very interesting scene, a corps de ballet scene of all the guests in their very finery, and in their dancing, we see the creature enter in. And I just have a picture of this, in which the creature comes out of the forest with a red brocade jacket covering his nakedness, and participates in the dance. He weaves himself in and out among the dancers who don't notice him at all, but of course, Victor notices him, and Victor is terrified. And so at this point, the creature is bent on vengeance because of his rejection. And Victor is aware now of what is to come. And so after the dancing takes place, we find that Victor's father and Victor's friend are discovered on the staircase, murdered. And of course, this makes the end of the wedding, and all the wedding guests depart in the same way that all of the birthday celebration guests at William's birthday had departed. And we have alone on the stage, this time, Elizabeth, Victor's bride, sister bride. And the creature comes out of the forest to engage in this really interesting pas de deux with Elizabeth that uses forms from traditional ballet and contemporary dance forms at the same time. And can we look at this? Thank you. So Elizabeth, of course, is terrified, and the creature begins with gentle pas de deux, in which he lifts her in the traditional way and moves to almost a scene of violence, a kind of rape scene. He's thrown off his jacket, so he is naked, in a way matching her white costuming. And they carry out this pas de deux. In which he lifts and leaps and throws, using a great deal of groundwork, which is typical of contemporary dance, but not ballet. So we have a hybrid here of contemporary dance gestures and classical balletic dance gestures. And then we have the body-strewn staircase here in the background. The creature throws Elizabeth on the ground and kills her. And I want to show you now the final scene that follows this immediately. So Victor enters and discovers his dead bride. And he's heartsick. And he has a gun. There's a gun. And Elizabeth has had the gun, but the gun gets thrown down. And Victor and the creature engage in a series of pas de deux. And I'm showing you an image here of them in their pas de deux. The creature has a coat on that matches Victor's. Victor has his wedding suit on, in which they do parallel movements to indicate their essential sameness, their relationship. But after the creature has killed Elizabeth, Victor becomes desperate, and Victor then engages in a series of pas de deux with the creature, in which they wrestle, almost like Jacob and the angel, in which Victor finally recognizes and acknowledges the existence of the creature. But of course, at this point, it's really too late. So can we see this last scene? What happens after this set of pas de deux, I'm sorry, please, is that the gun reemerges and Victor is going to shoot, but he's going to shoot the creature, but instead he turns it on himself. And we have this very powerful final scene in which the creature's vengeance turns to grief. And he straddles Victor in a parallel movement to the creation scene. He grabs the book that Victor had used to try to reanimate Victor. And so we have this scene of intense grief, a kind of pietà, in which the creature embraces, again, as he did in the creation scene, the dead Victor, his progenitor, with whom he can never have the relationship that he sought. And he rises and takes hold of Victor's hand and faces the fire and the universe and the road ahead. Do we have just a minute more? Is that all right? So I want to conclude with just a few brief comments about what a bioethics of disability might do. And of course, I've offered up this reading of the Frankenstein ballet to talk about relationships between parents and children when a child born with a disability, an unexpected child, enters into the family. And I didn't do a lot of that because I didn't explicate that as fully as I do in the longer articles, but I wanted to share with you the forms and the themes of the ballet in hopes that you will be able to appreciate it and buy the DVD and see it yourself. But I want to just end suggestively with some of the premises that I have put forward about a bioethics of disability. And I want to begin by a quote from Harriet McBride Johnson, the late disability activist and disability rights attorney, who claimed that the presence or absence of disability doesn't predict quality of life. And this, of course, is not what is generally understood when a child with a disability or a person with a disability enters into a family. And this is really the work of disability narrative, to show, in terms of bioethics, that the presence or absence of disability is not what it is that predicts quality of life. And so I've proposed, and this is a very tentative proposal, that what we all need is what I call disability cultural competence, and that is for doctors, healthcare professionals, patients, in other words, all of us, to develop disability cultural competence. Cultural competence is understood as a recognizable component of medical education. We have cultural competence around gender and around ethnicity, but very little development of disability cultural competence. And what disability cultural competence would bring to us is what critical disability studies has brought to us, and that is that we all need to know our history as people with disabilities. We all need to know our culture and our arts, and I have helped to contribute to this. We all need to know our technology, and most of all, we all need to know our rights. So I'm going to stop there with disability cultural competence. Thank you for your patience.